Jews began to settle in this piece of land that we know of as Israel today around the 1300 BCs, and the people that they had to contend with for the resources were known as the Canaanites. Now, there's a lot of debate as to who the Canaanites actually were. Some people say that they were the Phoenicians, but keep in mind that the Phoenicians were also a mishmash of cultures, kind of like the United States. There is also another theory by several historians that the Jews were also a Canaanite tribe, and that their culture just evolved to a point where they were able to subjugate everybody else. That's why some definitions of the word Canaanite are the humiliated ones. If you want a reference for how the Jews dealt with the Canaanites being on the land that God gave them, here is Deuteronomy 20 verse 16. You could find this in any Christian Bible, also the Torah. However, of these people's cities, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall not allow any soul to live. By the year 1020 BC, the Jewish monarchy was established, and they had complete and total control of the land that we know of as Israel today. But by 930 BC, it was divided into the kingdom of Israel and that of Judah. The division between these two kingdoms left them open to an attack by the most powerful empire at the time, the Assyrians. By 722 BC, both Israel and Judah fell under their might. This was one of the first expulsions of Jews from their homeland into what was known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Yet the Assyrians, as unbeatable as they were, met their defeat at the hands of the Babylonians at the Battle of Nineveh in 612 BC. And you would figure, since the Babylonians defeated the oppressors of the Jews would be free, but that did not happen. By 586 BC, the Jews were conquered and enslaved by those Babylonians, and thousands of Jews made their first diaspora. Some traveled west to what we know of as Iraq, some went up north to Lebanon, even some of the borders of Turkey. 50 years later, in 538 BC, the Jews were freed and allowed to go back to their homeland due to the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquering the Babylonians and ending their rule and subjugation of these people. Now, we're about to approach the Hellenistic era, and there's something you need to know about this part of the world. Israel, Lebanon, Western Syria, it's known as the Levant. It is one of the most important pieces of land in the Mediterranean because you could see it connects Africa with Egypt, Asia to the east, and technically Turkey, which is a gateway to Europe. So it connects three continents together. 333 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the entirety of the Levant, giving him full control of this access point. For over 2 centuries, Israel and the entirety of the Levant was under the control of the Greeks until it fell back into Jewish hands around 140 BC. Inevitably, inescapably, like every empire that touches the Mediterranean at that time, they fell to the Romans in 63 BC. The Jews refused to stay subject to Roman rule, and they led 2 revolts with constant guerrilla warfare against their occupiers. The first Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire took place in 66 AD, and that resulted in an estimated 1 million deaths. The second revolt took place 70 years later, around 136 AD, which resulted in the death of another 500,000 Jews. Now, here's something you have to pay attention to after that revolt. We are looking at a census of the Jewish population in Israel made by the Jewish-Italian statistician Sergio della Pergola. As you could see, in the 1st century, and most likely for 1,000 years before, the majority of the population of Israel was Jews. That began to change once the Jews were massacred after the revolts and the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem. By the 5th century, Jews became a minority in Israel, while Christians became the majority. Let's talk about it. Roman leadership was determined to not only destroy the Jews, but the Jewish culture. They changed the name of their holy city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. At every major city, the Jews were persecuted. They were not allowed to live in Jerusalem, nor were they allowed to worship in the city. This led to a further diaspora of the Jews, fleeing now to Egypt, Turkey, southern Greece. As the centuries progressed, they fled all the way to the tip of Morocco, all the way to Spain and Italy, Iran, Iraq. For 2 centuries, Israel was run by pagan rule until 313 AD, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. By 335, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most holy church in all of Christianity, was built in Jerusalem, making Jerusalem now the holiest Christian city. The Roman Empire fell. That did nothing to the status of the Jews in Israel or Jerusalem. It simply became known as the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Jews were still kept from the land. At this time, Israel was no longer referred to as Israel. It was broken up into two spots, Syria Phoenice and Syria Palestina. Eventually, it was called Palestina Prima. Lands of the Palestines were further Christianized by the Byzantine Empire until they lost control of it to the Sassanid Persians in 614 AD. Yet Persian rule was short-lived, only for 15 years, when the Byzantines reclaimed it in 629. By 637 AD, the Byzantines and the Persians lost the entirety of their influence in Jerusalem as it fell into the hands of the Muslim caliphates, and Jerusalem fell peacefully. It was only at this time, after 500 years of exile, that the Jews were allowed to come back to live and worship in Jerusalem. The Muslims had very little interest in forcing conversions of Jews or Christians, since they were able to excise a tax on the non-believers called the jizya. So it was actually profitable for the Muslim landowners to make sure that they did not have too many converts. And 5 decades later, around 690 AD, the Muslims constructed the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in the entirety of Islam, and it's theorized that this is where Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac. After the construction of the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem has become a holy center for the three faiths: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For 3 centuries, the Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in relative peace. Jerusalem remained a holy city, while the lands of Palestine became economically stagnant. The population dropped within that time from about 1 million people to 300,000. There were a lot of Christians who left the lands of Israel to go to some parts of Europe, Northern Africa, and there was an influx of Muslim population, of course, because Jerusalem did become a major Muslim holy city. By 1099 AD, the Christians decide to take back the Holy Lands, and they launch their first crusade. They succeed. They end up taking Jerusalem. When the Christians entered the gates of Jerusalem, amidst their holy city, they engaged in a slaughter of Jews and Muslims. The death toll is estimated to be between 10,000 to 75,000. For 2 centuries, Jerusalem and most of Palestine was like a game of hot potato between the Christians and the Muslims. The Christians would retake it, the Muslims would retake it. It was most notably retaken by Salah ad-Din in 1187 AD. Yet by the mid-1200s, the Christians and the Muslims had a much larger problem at their hands: the Mongol invasions, and they made it all the way into Gaza. While the French did make temporary alliances with the invading Mongols to weaken the Islamic caliphates, the Mongolian incursions were one of the deadliest threats to Western civilization. While the West does not want to admit it, they have the Mamluk Sultanate and their cavalry to thank for stopping the Mongol incursions into the Middle East from going further up north and out west. They ended up using the lands of Palestine as a buffer zone to keep them at bay. Unfortunately for the lands of Palestine, the Crusades and the Mongol incursions crushed the economy of this area. It ended up becoming a bit of a backwater. But something notable did happen. By the end of the 12th century, the majority of the population of Palestine were Muslim, but the population was so small, just over 225,000 people, when over 1,000 years ago, the total population was around 2.5 million. Something I want you to keep in mind about the Crusades. There were 9 of them in total, and the last one ended around 1290 AD. While Jerusalem was in the hands of the Christians, only Christians were allowed safe passage. The times that Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands, everyone was allowed to worship. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Palestine and the entirety of the Levant for another 200 years until the Turks took over in 1516. Now, while this area was under the control of the Mamluks, they destroyed every single Crusader outpost and demolished any town that could potentially support another Crusader invasion. While it was very successful in preventing any further Christian incursions, it did destroy the economy of this region. What made things even worse was that the bubonic plague ended up hitting around 1347 AD. The Black Plague ended up hitting the Mamluk Empire harder than many other regions in the Middle East, especially in northern Egypt, which made it very easily transmissible to the area of the Levant. Let's take a look at the census of the population in Palestine before the Black Death and after the Black Death. You could see that before it was about 225,000 people, but after the Black Death, nearly 1/3 of the population was wiped out. There were only 150,000 people entirely in the lands of Palestine, while over 1,000 years ago, the population was about 2.5 million. By 1516, Palestine and the entirety of the Levant fell to Ottoman rule and did not leave their grasp until the end of World War I in 1918. At the same time of the Ottoman conquest of Palestine, the Spanish and the Portuguese expelled all the Jews and Muslims from their country. These people had no place to go. And a movement was started by Joseph Nazi, a Portuguese diplomat, for the displaced Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic Jews to come to the lands of Palestine. Just in case you're not aware, there are several ethnic divisions of the Jewish people. There are the Ashkenazi, who primarily dwelled in Europe. There are the Sephardic, who dwelled in Portugal, Spain, Northern Africa, and Turkey. And then there are the Mizrahi Jews. That is just the term for all of the Jews that fled east. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, some parts of the former Soviet Republic, even some parts of northwestern India. There is a large Jewish population also in Ethiopia, in eastern India, and even in China, the Kaifeng Jews. Now, this is quite significant. Going back to the census, you can see that by 1533, they had some way of measuring the actual numbers of the population of Palestine. You could see that the population increased from 150,000 to 157,000. And even though the Ottomans were not known for their economic ingenuity, they were more known for conquest and other kinds of brutality, the region of Palestine began to flourish at the influx of this new Jewish and Muslim population. At this point of time, most of these Sephardic settlements were located in the town of Tiberias and the surrounding regions. And something you must keep in mind is that Jerusalem, the holy city for the three faiths of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, was relatively peaceful. It was said that you could find a church, a synagogue, and a mosque on the same block, and nobody was fighting over who got to go where. Even though Jerusalem was relatively peaceful, that did not mean that the lands of Palestine were. Let's talk about the Druze. The Druze, I hope I'm saying this right, they are their own ethno-religious group. They are scattered around Syria, Lebanon, modern-day Israel. The Druze are not Christian, they are not Jewish, they are not Muslim. They are Druze. They have their own faith, which is almost a blend of all three Abrahamic religions with Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, maybe even some Sikhism. It's fascinating. While the Druze were subject to the Ottomans at the time, they had their own internal power structure, and that almost disintegrated in the Druze Civil War that took place in 1658. It was considered to be the most violent conflict that took place under Ottoman rule in the Levant. While the conflict only lasted 10 years, the Ottomans were unable to secure rule in northern Palestine until the 1750s. By 1799, guess who ended up controlling Palestine and the regions of the Levant? Napoleon Bonaparte. And he had some plans. He actually had an idea to form a Jewish state in Palestine. But whatever plans Napoleon had for that part of the world did not end up working out because he ended up being routed by the British. He had to retreat, and as we all know, Napoleon ended up dying in exile about 20 years later. And even by the 1800s, the most violent faction in Jerusalem were the Christians. It was because the Christians kept fighting over who got the rights to go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the most holy church in all of Christianity. I am now going to quote from the JerusalemExperience.com. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was meticulously partitioned between the Greek Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches. Tensions between the groups ran so deep that the keys to the shrine and its doors were safeguarded by a pair of neutral Muslim families. By 1836, the Safed earthquake hit northern Palestine, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and killed at least 10,000 people. It left this region in total disarray. And it was around this time where Sir Moses Montefiore, an Italian Jewish businessman, decided to start building Jewish communities in Palestine. Some say that Montefiore was inspired by the predictions on the Jewish calendar that it was now the time for the Jews to start resettling in Palestine. Whatever the reasons, he began to build Jewish communities outside of the gates of Jerusalem where things were still quite dangerous, but he invited the poor Sephardic and Ashkenazi to live there and try to grow. What's eerie is that the building of these settlements were predictive of something. By the 1850s, pogroms were spreading all over Eastern Europe. If you don't know what a pogrom is, it is just a mass killing of Jews, and that is something that Eastern Europe did a lot. Mass pogroms in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania led to another mass exodus of the Jewish population into the lands of Palestine. From 1800 to 1890, the population of Jewish people increased by 500%, from 7,000 to 43,000. At the time, they were still a minority. There were 57,000 Christians at the time and 432,000 Muslims, constituting about 532,000 people in the lands of Palestine by 1890. Now, while I jumped ahead to 1890, you should pay attention to the year 1882, since that is the year of the first Aliyah. Aliyah means the Jewish immigration from where they are currently living to the lands of Palestine. There were 6 major aliyahs to Palestine, which is now modern-day Israel, if you count the last one, which is the Aliyah Bet, and that was illegal Jewish immigration into the land. Between the year 1881 to 1948, Jewish people began to migrate to Palestine, and this period of time was known as the Aliyahs. There were 5 official Aliyahs that took place, but there was a 6th one called the Aliyah Bet, which took place a little bit before and during World War II, when Jewish people were illegally emigrating from Europe into Palestine. Now, the first Aliyah took place from 1881 to 1903, and mainly it was a result of the Russian pogroms and Romanian anti-Semitism. So about 30,000 Jewish people fled these lands and went into Palestine. About 2,000 to 3,000 Jewish people also left Yemen, but they did it for messianic reasons. Let's go back to the census for the population of Palestine, and we can see in the year 1890, which is around the middle of the first Aliyah, the population of Jewish people increased from 7,000 to 43,000. So that is a 500% increase in the population. So you can see there is a boom going on with this first Aliyah. In 1894, a French captain by the name of Alfred Dreyfus was accused of selling French military secrets to the Germans, and simply because of his Jewish lineage, he was found guilty. There was no justice found for him. And this was at a time when France was considered the most liberal country in the world and the safest country for Jewish people in Europe to live. It was a resounding message to a lot of the Jewish population that they will never be able to live freely in Europe, so they were inspired to either go to Palestine or America. Now, the term Zionism has been around for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years, but it was not made into a political party until this man, Theodor Herzl, started it in 1897. Pause to read the definition of Zionism. The definition of Zion is just a hill in Jerusalem, but that became synonymous with all of Jerusalem, and eventually it became synonymous with all of the Kingdom of Israel. Goals stated for the first Zionist movement were the expedient promotion of settlement of Jewish agriculturists, artisans, and businessmen in Palestine, the organization and bringing together of all Jews through local and general events according to the laws of various countries. 3, the strengthening of Jewish feeling and national consciousness. 4th, preparatory steps for obtaining the government approval which is necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose. But there were ultra-Orthodox Jews who believed that it was impossible for a Zionist state to form because the Messiah has not returned. Just look at the Haredim. By 1905, the Russians decided to have another pogrom, and they waged one in Odessa, where hundreds of Jews were brutally massacred. This triggered another 35,000 Jewish people to come to Palestine. But they weren't just from Russia. They also came from Northern Africa, Morocco, Iran, other parts of the Middle East. By 1909, 65 Zionist families ended up going out into the desert and start building the foundations for a city, which ended up becoming Tel Aviv. About 15 years later, Jewish engineers started buying malaria-infested swamplands that were considered uninhabitable at some points. They ended up using their engineering skills to drain these swamps and turn those same swamps into lush farmlands. But there was another movement which was resisting the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, and it was that of Arab nationalism. For up to 4 centuries, the Arabic nations in the Middle East and beyond were subject to Ottoman rule, and they had their own identities. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Egypt, they were their own countries, and Palestine is no exception. By 1908, the Young Turk Revolution took place, in which a group of progressive intellectuals took control of the Turkish government and forced the Sultan at the time to reinstate the constitution that was granted in 1876. Now, because the Young Turk Revolution was led by intellectuals who were not just from Turkey, some of them were Greeks and a lot of them were Jews, the Zionist movement did try to get the Young Turks on their side, but that failed. And it is widely accepted by the rest of the world that when the Young Turk government took over, they ruined the Ottoman Empire because they chose very poorly in deciding which side they're going to be on in World War I. Even by the 1890s, there were reported violent incidents of land disputes between Arabs and Jewish people, in which the Jewish people would buy land from the landlord and would vacate the Palestinians who were living off of that land. Just in case you're curious about the Zionist sentiment at the time towards the Arabs in Palestine, I could sum it up in this article that was written by Israel Zangwill, who was one of the heads of the Zionist movement in England. The Arabs should recognize that the road of their renewed national glory lies through Baghdad, Damascus, and Mecca, and all the vast territory freed from them from the Turks, and be content so far as Palestine is concerned to be politically submerged. The powers which freed it and them have surely the right to ask them not to grudge the petty strip necessary for the renaissance of a still more downtrodden people. And then World War I happens, which at that time is the bloodiest war in human history. World War I was fought between the Axis powers, which were Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Allies, who were the British Empire, the French, and the Russians, eventually the United States. Because Palestine was in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was allied with the Germans, the Allies in England, France, and Russia thought that the Jewish people were going to be on the Axis powers' side. There were about 500,000 Jewish people serving in the Russian military, but that made Tsar Nicholas over here think that he just had a fifth German column that would just destroy Russia from within. The Americans felt the same way. Of course, the French and British did as well. In 1916, in the middle of World War I, the British and French secretly met and formed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, deciding who would get what in the Middle East after the conclusion of World War I. Pause to read how this land was distributed and try to understand how it is leading to a lot of the global instability today. Note that in this agreement, Palestine would be under British, French, and Russian protection. In 1917, Alfred Balfour, the British foreign minister, issued the famous Balfour Declaration, stating that England was going to create a Jewish state in the lands of Palestine. This is the letter that Alfred Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild about it. There's a lot of hypothesizing as to why the British issued this decree. One of the theories is that the British wanted Russia to get back into the war because in World War I, by 1917, Russia exited the war after the revolution. The British may have been hoping that if they do issue a Jewish state, that would ignite the Jewish people in Russia to get into the war again. Another reason was that England and the Allies were becoming even more anti-Semitic because they were thought to be in with the Germans and they wanted to just find a way to get rid of all of their Jewish population. One thing is certain, that the British did not do it out of any philanthropic cause because at the time they still subjugated nearly 48% of the world's surface. World War I finally concluded in November of 1918 when the Axis powers surrendered to the Allies. This was by far the most bloody war the world has ever seen, totaling over 25 million deaths. Of course, the world wanted to make sure that something like this would never happen again, so they tried to form an international coalition that would form some kind of unity to prevent such a war from happening. A proto-UN, and it was called the League of Nations. Long term, it did not work out. By 1922, the ill-fated League of Nations issued the Mandate of Palestine, giving the British sole control over this entire region, which is the lands of Palestine and the areas of Transjordan. The division was made very clear that no Jewish settlement was allowed in the Transjordan. While all of this was happening, the Third Aliyah was taking place, which lasted from 1919 to 1929, in which 40,000 Jewish people fled Europe for Palestine. One of the reasons why they went to Palestine instead of the United States was that by 1924, America closed its borders to Eastern and Southern Europeans. Didn't matter what descent they were. The largest component of Jewish people from the Third Aliyah came from Russia, once again because of anti-Semitism and the massacre of Jewish people during that war, since they were suspected of being German sympathizers. Between 500,000 to 700,000 Jewish people in Russia were displaced because of this. The next post is going to be about the Fourth Aliyah, the Fifth Aliyah, the Aliyah Bet, and the establishment of Israel as a country in 1948 and the subsequent wars that followed. In 1891, the Jewish Colonization Association was formed with the intent of bringing Jewish people from all over the world into Argentina. But within 5 to 10 years, that interest went from Argentina to the lands of Palestine. By 1914, the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association was formed for the same reasons. These were the two largest companies that held Palestinian lands at the time. And the reason why the vast majority of purchases of Palestinian land were done by associations was because the Ottoman Empire forbade most of the sales of Palestinian land to Jewish people. And the few land purchases that Jewish people were able to make during the Ottoman Empire before they fell in 1918 were pieces of land that were considered uninhabitable because of poor soil, or they were sparsely populated. Unfortunately, the earliest map I could find of Jewish land purchases dates back only to 1940. But you could see the vast bulk of the land that was bought was along the coast here, which was sparsely populated land. Jerusalem, Hebron, all the other very populous great cities, they are over here by the West Bank. In 1922, the population of mandated Palestine was 752,000 people, with 84,000 Jewish, 71,000 Christian, and 589,000 Muslims. So the Jewish population represented about 11% of all of Palestine. By 1917, the Arab population in Palestine began to feel very threatened, not only by Zionism, their growing fervor, and the growing disregard for the rights of the Arabs, but that of the Balfour Decree, which allowed the setting up of a Jewish state in the lands of Palestine. While that decree did say that the rights of non-Jews must be protected, the decree did not state which non-Jews had their rights which would be protected. By 1920, a minor riot broke out in Jerusalem between Arabs and Jews, but by 1921, the Jaffa riots occurred and they were far worse. In Jaffa's city center, Jewish communists started fighting Jewish socialists. Both were armed, and when Arabs got wind of this violent dispute, they were misinformed into thinking that this was an armed Jewish attack against the Arab population. And unfortunately, the Arabs responded in kind. They massacred dozens of Jewish people, and dozens of Arabs were massacred as well. In that same year, the Zionists formed their own paramilitary group called Haggadah, where initially they were meant to protect Jewish settlements against any kind of violence, but they ended up carrying out executions, assassinations, and mass slaughter against the Arab population. In 1924, Haggadah assassinated Jacob Israel Dahan, a Jewish lawyer, writer, journalist, and political activist who began to encourage cooperation between the Arabs. Once he started speaking against the unfairness of the Balfour Decree, he was taken out of the picture. From 1924 to 1929, the Fourth Aliyah was taking place, where about 81 to 83,000 Jewish people migrated from Europe to the lands of the British Mandate, which is Palestine and Transjordan. By 1928, the British gave up Transjordan and they allowed them to be their own independent state, ruled by their own Jordanian king. Before we go any further, you should know something about the Wailing Wall. It is the last wall left of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, after it was destroyed over 1,000 years ago by the Romans. The Wailing Wall may be the holiest center for Jewish people in the world, and it is located on the Temple Mount, which also holds the most holy Christian church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Dome of the Rock, one of Islam's most holy centers as well. And on August 15th, 1929, the Wailing Wall Committee, a fervent Zionist group, marched to the Wailing Wall with 300 demonstrators. They then claimed the Wailing Wall as theirs. They raised the Zionist flag, and some reports go that they were harassing Muslim families around the wall. This was viewed not only as a provocation, but a desecration upon something most holy to the Muslim world. Within 2 days, riots all over Palestine erupted, in which hundreds of Jews and Muslims were killed. The Zionists began to heavily militarize. They formed another paramilitary group called Irgun, which eventually was deemed a terrorist organization by the United Nations. While all of this was happening, the Fifth Aliyah was taking place, which lasted from 1929 to 1939, which saw an influx of 300,000 Jewish people from the east, way in Asia, but also in Central Europe, especially from Germany, since Hitler came to power and anti-Semitism was at its highest. By 1931, the population of Mandated Palestine was 1,033,000 people. There were 175,000 Jewish people there, 89,000 Christians, and 760,000 Muslims. Around this time, the people of Iraq won their independence from colonial rule, and the same happened for Syria against the French in 1936. So the idea of Arab independence wasn't just something abstract, it was something that was possible, and that is what the Palestinians wanted. In April of 1936, tens of thousands of Arab workers all over Mandated Palestine launched a strike where they would not work unless they were granted independence. This lasted for 6 months, but the British were able to finally break the strike. Unfortunately, later on that year, the Palestinians saw violence as their only recourse, and they began to fight, not only against the British occupiers, but against the Zionists. About 600 Jewish people were killed, maybe 300 to 500 British troops were killed, but over 6,000 Palestinian Arabs were killed. Hundreds were executed by hanging. While this was happening in Mandated Palestine, the Germans were keeping hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in concentration camps. The Jews were trying to escape the land because they knew they were not safe. Between 1933 and 1945, there were 44,000 of these camps built all across Europe. People debate as to how many people died in these camps. Some say it was 5 million, some people say it was 6 or 7 million. What we do know for a fact is that 25% of those people killed in the camps were children. Unfortunately for the Jewish population in Germany and all of Europe, they were not able to flee their lands to go to Mandated Palestine because after the Arab revolts ended in 1939, the British released the White Paper. The British White Paper did not allow Jewish people to buy land in Mandated Palestine in 95% of the area, and only 15,000 Jewish people a year could migrate there for 5 years. The Arabs wanted nothing to do with the White Paper. They rejected it wholeheartedly, while the Zionists started bombing and attacking British civil service centers in Mandated Palestine. But none of the protests did anything to stop this White Paper as being the policy method for Mandated Palestine until the British left in 1948. While the Fifth Aliyah ended in 1939 as a result of the British White Paper, the Sixth Aliyah, also known as the Aliyah Bet, began, in which Jewish people illegally emigrated from Europe into the lands of Mandated Palestine, and they did this at great risk. Any Jewish person illegally trying to come into the lands of Palestine were put in prison in Mauritius, Africa. We all know that World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945. We know the effect it had on the Jewish population, but what most people don't know is that the Arab world was actually highly aligned with a lot of Hitler's views. Nazi Germany was against the French and the British. That was enough to earn the Arab world's support. He was also a raging anti-communist, which the Arabs loved. Most importantly to the Arab world, especially the Arabs in Palestine, is that Hitler was anti-Zionist. So a lot of cooperation was actually happening between the Arab world and Hitler during this time. Throughout the course of World War II, 1.5 million Jewish people served to fight the Axis powers, which is one of the reasons why Italy kept bombing Tel Aviv and the neighboring cities almost every single day. In August of 1945, the United States dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, successfully ending World War II and terrifying the rest of the world into not even thinking about trying to start another one for quite some time. In 1947, there were 630,000 Jewish people in Mandated Palestine. That is about 1/3 of the population. So even though the British White Paper was meant to keep out Jewish immigration and made it illegal, they were still doing it. Within 1 year of World War II ending, the Zionists started launching terrorist attacks against British military and civil infrastructure all over mandated Palestine. The Zionists began orchestrating coordinated attacks, like the Night of the Bridges, where they took out 10 out of 11 British routes used to go into Palestine at the same time, successfully. The second and most famous terrorist act of the Zionists was destroying the King David Hotel, which was one of the British main military headquarters in that region. The Zionist militants were conducting terrorist attacks in Palestine since 1924, but they increased exponentially at the end of World War II. During the war, the Zionist militants were actually cooperating with the British just in case there was a German assault. The largest paramilitary group of the Zionists was called Haganah. They, along with Irgun and several other paramilitary groups, began to receive training from the British to form some kind of resistance against a potential German assault. But not every Zionist group was in cooperation. The Lehi definitely refused any cooperation with the British since they wanted the British out by any means necessary. In fact, Haganah, which had the largest amount of influence in the Zionist paramilitary groups, started helping the British hunt for non-cooperative Zionist factions. They even started going after Irgun. When Irgun realized that the Allies were going to win World War II, they started attacking the British again. But Haganah actually helped the British stop Irgun. And this period of time between 1944 to 1945 was called hunting season. They didn't actually kill each other. The Haganah just helped imprison Irgun until the war ended. But after World War II concluded in the middle of 1945, the British made it very clear that they were not going to ease the limitation of Jewish immigration into Palestine, and they were not in any rush to create a Jewish state in those lands. Then Irgun, Haganah, Lehi, and several other Zionist militant groups joined together and started committing wave after wave of terrorist attacks against Arabs and the British. Now keep this in mind. The Zionist paramilitary groups were trained by the British military, which meant that these Zionists were able to fight a modern war. And they had something that the British didn't. They were zealots. Conducted a series of terror attacks, not only in Palestine, but in London, Paris, several cities all throughout Europe. But the most notorious terrorist attack was the bombing of the King David Hotel. In July of 1946, Irgun, a then-known terrorist group, and eventually recognized as a terrorist group by the United Nations, bombed the British headquarters for mandated Palestine. 91 people in total were killed, 28 British citizens, 41 Arabs, 17 Jews, and one of many other nationalities. This bombing sparked outrage throughout the international community, even amongst the Zionists. Ben-Gurion, one of the founders of the Israeli government, called Irgun, after this bombing, called them the enemy of the Jewish people. Chaim Weizmann, who ended up becoming the first president of Israel, who was at the time the president of the World Zionist Organization, said this when he heard of the bombing: "I can't help feeling proud of our boys. If only it had been a German headquarters, they would have gotten the Victoria Cross." As a result, the British military began to limit the civil liberties of Jewish people in Palestine since they were so heavily linked to so many terrorist occurrences. The British began to limit severely the civil rights of Jewish people in Palestine since they were considered such a heavy threat. They started enacting curfews, roadblocks, random searches, mass arrests of swaths of Jewish people simply because they were Jewish. Did this because Zionism became synonymous with terrorism. Anti-Semitism, which was dying down near the end of World War II, began to spring its ugly head all over the West because of these brutal terrorist attacks. As the Zionist terror attacks kept coming, the Palestinian population also kept voicing their discontent against not only Zionism, but the British occupation. And eventually, the British population back home, still so exhausted after World War II, decided to vote against the British staying in Palestine. And by February of 1947, the British decided to terminate the Mandate of Palestine and turn the matter over to the newly formed United Nations. And by November 29th of that same year, after months of deliberation, the United Nations passes Resolution 181, granting the two-state solution to the lands of Palestine, an Arab state and a Jewish state, as you can see by this map. The United Nations at the time consisted of 56 voting countries. 33 countries voted for the partition plan, 13 countries voted against it, and 10 abstained. The Arab state and the Jewish state would, of course, both be independent, self-governing, but Jerusalem would be held by an international community to avoid conflict between these two factions. Immigration into the Jewish state would, of course, no longer be restricted. Now, while Proposition 181 did bring joy to millions of Zionists who simply just wanted a Jewish state, it brought a lot of discontent to the hardline Zionists who wanted the entirety of Palestine. This also sparked a great deal of outrage, not just from Palestinians, but from the entire Arab world. Under the United Nations partition plan, Arabs and Jewish people living in the Jewish state would be granted citizenship to that Jewish state, and Arabs and Jews in the Arab state would be granted citizenship in the Arab state. The table we're looking at right now is the population distribution for the United Nations partition plan of Palestine. Now you can see for the population of Jews, there would be about 10,000 of them in the Arab state, while there would be about 725,000 Arabs in the Arab state. So the Jewish people would be a small minority. But now if you look at the Jewish state, there'd be a population of about 500,000 Jews, yet a population of 407,000 Arabs, which means that there was a very large Arab minority within the Jewish state. So it was essential, according to the United Nations plan, that the Arabs had citizenship, that they had their basic civil rights protected. Within the city of Jerusalem, the population was 50-50, so that would not have been much of a big deal. To understand the Arab sentiment of the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, I will just tell you the quote from Abdul Rahman Azab, the Arab League's first Secretary General. The establishment of a Jewish state would lead to a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacre of the Crusades. He and many other leaders in the Arab world were certain that they would be able to eliminate a Jewish state upon its creation because they had overwhelming numbers supporting them. Within 24 hours of the passage of the UN partition plan for Palestine, a bus in the city of Fallujah was attacked by an Arabic mob containing 21 people and killing 7 Jewish people. A following attack occurred later on that day in which 2 Jews were killed. This led to a Jewish retaliation against that attack, and the emergence of the Israeli-Palestinian civil war took place. While there are reports saying that the Fallujah bus attack was not against the UN partition plan, that it was in fact a retaliatory attack against an earlier Zionist attack that took place 2 weeks prior, but we will never know. Either way, it was horrendous timing because the Zionist retaliation was brutal. Now, while the Israeli-Palestinian civil war was taking place, the British troops under the Mandate were still there. They did not leave until May of 1948. But even though there was a strong British military presence there, they did nothing to stop the violence. By May 14, 1948, the Mandate of Palestine were no more. The last of the British troops left, and the Zionists declared their land, Israel. Within 24 hours of that day, the United States and the Soviet Union both recognized Israel's existence as a state. Shortly after that, the entire Arab League attacked Israel all at once. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, along with the Muslim Brotherhood, all attacked Israel to eliminate it from the map. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic, non-secular organization founded in Egypt in 1928. When it was first built, it was meant to spread charity and education in defiance to British subjugation, but as the decades went by, it became more Islamic militant. Even though Israel was attacked from all sides with overwhelming force, they defeated each and every single one of their invaders. By the middle of 1949, each of those countries signed an armistice agreement to not attack Israel for the time being. The end result of the Israeli-Arab civil war was that the land that was going to be promised to the Arabs shrunk from this region in the Arab state down to this, less than 40% of what the UN partition would have granted them. As a result of Israel conquering the Palestinian lands, over 750,000 of them were displaced. Within 1 year, Jordan annexed the West Bank into their land and Egypt took the Gaza Strip. over 1 million Jewish people were expelled from their lands in Iraq, Iran, Syria, all over the Arab world. A lot of them ended up coming to Israel. Upon the establishment of the State of Israel from 1948 to 1951, the population of Jewish people in that area doubled. The next part of the series will most likely cover the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War. Sorry that this one took so long. Thank you.